All right, so let's talk about texturing. Now, so far we've talked about shading, which that's kind of the term, these terms, texturing, shading, materials, these can all be synonymous and mean different things in different 3D programs. But in a general sense, in Maya at least, shading and a shader is the actual material that you apply to something. Those shading presets is what gives it all of its material properties. And then a texture is when we can actually add either a file, like an image, or a different type of texture that I'll show you. It's called a procedural texture, a computer-generated texture, to kind of add even more realism to the images. So let me show you the basics of how this works in a couple of different windows that we'll be using and talk a little bit about UVs and whatnot. So the first thing I'm going to do is just create a real simple scene. So I'm sitting here in the default Maya view. I get there by going to, and I'm reviewing this because, again, I constantly accidentally drag something and like screw up the interface or lose a window or something like that. And it's really important to realize you can just easily go to workspaces, choose all these different types of workspaces, but just to keep it consistent for now, I'm just using the Maya Classic. You can click on Reset Maya Classic to Factory Default. And that'll kick you to this factory default that basically shows the giant perspective view, the channel editor, which we're going to get more into when it comes to animation, and that's about it. Now, I usually just open up the outliner to sit here, and sometimes I'll even open the attribute editor instead of the channel editor because, I don't know, I use that more, I'd say. But regardless, I'll go back to the channel box for now. It doesn't matter. I'm going to set up a real quick and simple scene. I'm going to create a cube and double click it and check out its presets before I create it. I'm just going to make a 1 by 1 by 1 with one division each, the most simple cube possible. And then if I hit the F key on the keyboard for frame, that will bring me right up to the cube and frame it right around the view. And then I'm just going to create a plane as well, set my cube on something. And I'll move this up to be sitting directly on the plane. So maybe I'll go in the translate Y in the channel box. I'll type in 0.5. All right, now that I could also do that in the attribute editor in the pcube1 transform node. So sometimes there's two places to put it in, but the channel box is more kind of geared towards showing you animatable elements. And the attribute kind of has everything under the sun, whether it's animatable or not. But move down here, I've got this. Now we're gonna need some light in our scene. So I'll just very quickly, Arnold lights, physical sky. Great, and now we want to, so if I were to just open up the Arnold render view right now, I'm gonna have this start to render so we can actually see something. Drag this over to the side. Now I wanna put materials on these, which is what we've done so far using the Arnold standard surface material. So I'm gonna right click this cube, choose assign new material, click Arnold. Now, I will point out as I'm looking at this and look at the assignment new material, if I select all of these filters over on the left, there are quite a few materials that are standard in Maya. There's even more that you can import or create yourself. We went through some of the default ones with the Maya software renderer, like Blinn, Lambert. As far as the Arnold ones, they all start with AI, and we've been using the AI standard surface material because there's a lot you can do with that. There is a bunch of other ones with hair and all kinds of different, the layered shader is also very, very popular as far as being able to create different layered effects. There's just, there's so deep you can get with materials and texturing. And I definitely would, highly recommend all of you just, do more research on anything that you find yourself kind of drawn to when it comes to 3D. You can get deeper in modeling, you can get deeper in texturing, whatever you seem to enjoy, dig a little deeper and play around. There's a ton in here. I'm going to start with this AI standard surface material, and right away, look at my render view. All of a sudden, that looks nicer than just the initial crappy gray. And I'm going to name my material because just like I've asked you guys to do, I'm going to put a different AI standard surface on each object. So I can do it here in the attribute editor just by getting over to this far right node. Now, if you're attaching it to a model that you've just done a ton of box modeling to, and you might have like endless tabs up here for your nodes, I touched on that briefly, that you can always remove your history. If you go to, there it is, okay. So under edit, you can delete by type and choose history. See, there's even a hotkey because it's such a common thing. Once your models are complete, you can delete the history on them, which will lose the ability to step through each individual node and go back in history and make changes. But most of the time, once you're there, and you want to kind of like save a new version of your file and lock down the history. So that'll make it a little easier to get to your node here. Or once you create a material, you can always open the hypershade, which is this little sphere right here. And that opens, oops, opening on my other screen. That opens this window, which shows you all the materials, starts with these 4 default ones, and here's our AI standard material. And I can rename it in either place. I'm gonna go ahead and rename it here inside the hypershade, and I'm just gonna name this one box mat for box material. And maybe I'll close this, get it out of the way, and see that yes, indeed, that also updated here. Now I'm gonna add another material. Instead of just adding the box mat to this ground, I'm gonna add a separate one. Again, assign new material by right-clicking. Do it in any way. You can create the material first in the hypershade, then assign it to selections or middle mouse drag it to things. Arnold, AI standard surface. And now just peeking at our render view, it's as we would expect with a basic AI standard surface, see some very subtle reflection up against here. Very basic, perfect lighting right now. That's kind of a bad angle for anything real, but we're just gonna take a quick look at the texture so I won't go too deep with it. What I will do though, just because it's good practice, is to open the AI Sky Dome light and up its samples. I'm gonna go to 4, just so as we render, Arnold render, things will look decent, more decent as it starts to go. So I'll put that on my other screen and just let that run for now. So what I've showed you so far is, okay, I can select this box mat, and now I can start to change these presets, right? So we go in and there's all these different things, and you can blend them, and we can really create any look, that we really need in the world. When you're changing these presets to create all these different types of materials, from clay to rubber to different chromes, all it's really doing is playing with these sliders, really just in these first 3 shelves. Like just base and specular are handling most of those changes, and then transmission handles the opacity. And it's really, really helpful to be able to understand how, if you want to go past the presets, that you can like make something look even more or less metal-like, or more or less, whatever type of material you're working with within these presets. I can't stress enough how awesome this is, that, for years and years and years, it took a lot more than just adding one type of material to a bunch of objects and creating these presets to get these types of looks. Like, it's really powerful, but it's really important to understand kind of how that's working under the hood. The next step is to show you how you can actually add textures to things to bring even more realism. That's when you get into more actually looking like photorealistic. And textures can get extremely complicated and extremely deep, but you can make things look extremely photorealistic in the process. So what I'm going to do is show you the basics of how to begin texturing and how Maya kind of handles it with its different windows and whatnot. So the first thing I want to show you is what's called a shading network. So now that I've got this set up, you can see our basic thing here. If we open the hypershade view, a moment to load up. Okay, so the hypershade view really has these 4 major areas, all right? We've got kind of the browser area where it's showing us all of our different materials. Once you've got a whole bunch, hundreds of materials in the scene, it'd be really nice to go through and be able to see them like this and be able to just select them. So I've got my box mat, I've got my AI standard, which I'm going to rename this one to floor mat, just to show that, hey, we've got a floor material as well to play with. And these are all of the attributes, which basically is the same thing you'll see in the attribute editor for that particular material. Over here is where you create new nodes. So this is the little box that pops up and you go add, create material, but you can go ahead and create materials just from this if you want. And there's a lot more than just materials in this here. There's also specific material type nodes that you can there's even lights in here. You can create quite a few different types of things in here. And then this area is what I want to concentrate on for a moment and show you, is press tab to create a node. All right, great. But this is the kind of graph area. And the way that you graph show you what I'm talking about. The way that you graph a material is you select the material, then you right click on it. There's all these different options you can do. One of them here is graph network. All right, so you want to choose graph network on this box material. and you can see these little boxes come up. I'm going to make this hypershade a little bigger. This is one of those things that it just sure helps to have two monitors or just have a nice process of constantly like hiding or minimizing or something. Maya just has so many windows. I usually have like these type of secondary windows sitting on a second monitor while I leave my main Maya window up and can see what's going on. But the process of screen sharing, we'll have them all together here. Now, what this did is this showed the graph for this particular material. And initially, it just has two nodes in it. These individual boxes represent a node. Everything in Maya is a node. You've heard me say that term. That just means basically like an object. And the way they are all connected to each other is how we end up with all these amazing looks and effects and everything. Now, you can use the Alt key and your middle mouse button, just like you can to navigate in the regular viewport, right? You can do the same thing. Back to an interesting spot. You can do the same thing. Close my render view. This will probably speed things up for me so it's not constantly on. There we go. Do the same thing inside of here. If I hold Alt, I can zoom in and out, and I can pan around, which can be very useful once this graph gets a lot more complex. Now, a lot of hardcore power users and real intense, like industry professional texture artists, they will work pretty much 100% in this view. Like they will actually create nodes and create these extremely complicated node networks out of these little boxes. What these are, these show all of the inputs and the outputs of each individual node. So right now, by default, we've got one connection from the color node into this surface shader node. And you can actually click on these little circles and you get these lines and you can connect nodes together. And you can create all of these fancy hierarchies with all these different nodes. And you can also, once you've made a connection, you can select the line between the connection, you can click delete to break the connection. And you'll see as we add a couple of textures and things into this, how this starts to get more complicated. But the AI standard surface has a whole lot of nodes you can connect things in and out of. All right, so this is kind of the base level, just to show you that this graph exists, how to get to it. Again, we right click on the material and say graph network. If I were to right click on this default Lambert material, which is that gray, this default in the Maya software, graph network, you can see it's got a different network. The material has a lot less in its initial node, but then it's got this shading group node and this particle node that's part of it. So I'm gonna go back, graph my AI standard surface material. Another thing to point out that this is just the nodes that are for actual materials inside this hypershade. When we talk about nodes and node connections, that's actually a deeper, more kind of standardized method for working in Maya if you want to work at that level. It's worth pointing out here that under Windows, there's a node editor. Now there's so many boxes and editors. If you look through all this, like every single one of these and all these drop downs are all different editors that you can open up in different windows. There's so much. Like even the animation editors, like I'm probably going to show you guys half of these and show you how they work and what they're used for. And that's even on top of just the basic keyframe animation that you'll be expected to do in our group project. So there's a lot here, but it's worth kind of seeing the main ones. Outliner, this is what's coming and going right here. We've also got our outliner box to come and go. But if I open the node editor, opens on my other side, I can actually select, is this going to graph? I thought this was going to show me the nodes in the scene. Interesting. All right, well, I'll come back to that. I'm not worried about the individual scene nodes. Somehow I can graph the scene nodes here and I can actually like create and edit and create things in my scene with kind of a node view like that. It might not just happen with some basic models, but once I start adding some other elements, you could start to see things show up in there. Regardless, go back to the hypershade. And now I want to talk about mapping. So mapping is the process of taking one of these parameters. So like, for example, right now I could change the color of this. So I'm on my box material and we're looking at it in the viewport. I'll hit the 6 key, so it's going to show us textures and all that good stuff. And over here, my hypershade hidden just with the attribute editor open, I can change the color. This is one of the things that changes with presets, but if I just click on color here, drag this over towards red. Oh, I have the wrong one selected. There we go. Box material, change my color, start to drag it over towards red. See it actually changes. Arnold render view, right? That actually changes. Now you can see that color starting to reflect and splash off of the nearby surfaces and all that stuff. So you've all seen that so far. But the next level is to be able to actually wrap an image around this box and to actually have it, you know, that's how you can get more photorealistic, is actually put photos around things. The way we do that is we can map an image onto these particular attributes. That's what these little check mark boxes are, all right? Is these represent channels or attributes or properties, all synonymous terms that just mean kind of things you can adjust for this particular node. You can attach different maps to them. So let me show you what I mean. But first off, I'm just going to open the browser real quick, and I'm just going to go grab an image and go to images, and I'm just going to search for a baby monkey. And this guy looks fun. We'll use this very excited baby monkey. I'm going to save the image as. I will save it to my desktop, sure. All right, so now I've got this baby monkey image. Hide that, come back here. Now, so let's see what happens if I go to try and map an image onto this. Now I'm just gonna leave the color red because as soon as we add a map, the color no longer applies at all. Okay, so we're gonna basically, as soon as we hit this button, it's gonna replace whatever was in this slider. So the color is what really shows through to the eye and what kind of the light is bouncing off of and reflecting back. So that's where we want to put a file texture. We can click on this little thing here, and that will open this Create Render Node dialog box, okay? And by default, it has 2D textures, 3D textures, environment textures, and other textures all selected. So you see all these crazy options. I'll show you a couple of the options and explain some of the differences between these main sets. But for right now, we just want to use file, right? So this file texture, that allows us to actually get a file and put it on there. Now, before I've added anything, open my render window back up, it just kind of goes back to this gray color. In fact, it's not even as nice as it was at the default standard surface because it doesn't have that color, that white color coming through. It just turned it to just dull gray in all aspects, right? Drag that off. And now I can click this little folder in the image name, and it opens up this dialog box. And all right, it's going into downloads because that's the last thing I did. But what it should be going into is our actual project folder. We've got our source images. I'll put it in the root of this, all right? So we'll end up putting all of our file textures in the root of here. So that's something I'd like all of you to do just as a default is when you're actually using a file texture, maybe I'll rename this to, rename this baby monkey, all right? Put your texture in this folder first before you load it into your scene. So now we've got this baby monkey sitting in the spot. Now we can go in and add it into Maya, all right? Now, first off, before I even add it, I'm gonna show you that if I go back to my box mat and I click Graph Network, all of a sudden that network has changed. Before, it was just these two, and now it's added two new nodes. It's added a Place 2D Texture node, and it's added a File node, both of which are necessary, where it's taking the UVs, which I'll explain in a minute, it's connecting those, and then it's taking the out color, sending it into the base color of this node. And once again, I won't get too deep in this, but it's very important for you to kind of know this is here and understand how to get to it. Again, right-click any material and choose Graph Network. Because when you get into advanced things, it'll go beyond the scope of this beginner class. There's a lot of hardcore texture artists who will just spend hours in this view alone, just creating nodes and connecting and disconnecting these hierarchies and getting very, very complicated layered shading effects with, you know, up to like 100 nodes I've seen. I've seen this massive shading networks, they're called, that create these really, really pristine looks. And it's all based on connecting everything through this view like this. So as we add maps and things to the interface, we're going to be adding nodes into that view as well. So now let's go in and actually add a image. Now, because I was clicking around on this, as I click around on these different things, notice that the attribute editor changes. That's actually helpful. So if I want to get to the 2D texture placement node, if I want to get to the file node, if I want to be on the actual material node. So on the material node, that little map turned into this icon. This is called the downstream icon. So instead of this little checkerboard, we now have this icon letting us know there's a map there. And because there's a map there, there's no longer a way to drag this slider, and there's no way to change the color, because it's basically saying, okay, for this color channel, we're going to apply this map instead of a color. So if I click this button, all that does is just enter that node. So it's really the same thing as just going from here to clicking on here, and that takes us to this file node. All right, so now that we've got this file node, I can finally click on this, and I'll go into my, so notice how it says my downloads folder, because last time I was playing around, I just picked something from my downloads folder, but it actually does show me the folder structure right here from my current project. So I can very quickly just get to source images and find my baby monkey right here. Open it up, and because I have the 6 key press, so again, 4 is wireframe, 5 is shaded, so you won't see your textures with just the 5 key. The 6 key shows textures also. So now all of a sudden I can see, in some weird way, this baby monkey wrapped around this box. 7, which shows lights, it appears that in the viewport at least, HDRI lights and physical skylights don't want to show up in just the viewport like this. But it appears that area lights will. So you could create a scene with area lights and kind of see, it still doesn't look the same as the render. We can at least see better, more of a preview. I'm honestly not sure if there's a way to preview a physical sky or an HDRI light in the viewport. So that's interesting. So regardless, we have a texture on here now. Now, of course, it's just kind of put all over the place, but if I were to indeed open up my render view, it's not lying to me, but I can see the texture on the box. Turn this back around a little. All right, so I see this wrapping around it, which is pretty cool. But now the key is, now, as you would expect, we can only wrap a 2D image around a shape, kind of like wrapping paper. You know, if you're wrapping a present, it only, you know, will go in a specific way. And the way that works is called UVs. And what these are, now if you remember in your modeling toolkit, we've got our whole object, we've got vertices, which are just little points, the 0 dimension, and we've got the 1 dimension, 2 points connecting to each other with a line, then we've got 3 dimensions, or 2 dimensions with lines pointing together with a face, gives us 2D, and then finally the 3rd dimension connects these faces together. Then we've got UVs over here. And UVs are also basically vertices, but they are a different set that the object, you can manipulate those, and that is what the program uses to wrap a texture around an object in a particular way. Those of you that have some 3D experience, you may already know that UVs can be very tedious to deal with to get the effect you're looking for. When you go to like texture and actual character, I'll show you a couple of UV textured character layouts here shortly after we go through the basics. You can really spend a serious amount of time creating UVs and laying out your UVs to get your textures to wrap around properly without any seams. All right. So the way that you kind of envision this is what's called, so far I haven't really introduced a new editor. I just opened the Hypershade and have showed you kind of how to graph the network here. So again, right click, graph network. You can even zoom in and see my baby monkey thing here. All right. What we can do is actually tell it how to map the image. So I'm going to go back to object mode. All right. And it doesn't really matter where the front is. But there's a UV. Now I'm in the modeling tool set here. And over here, after curve surfaces deform, there's UV. There's a whole bunch of different tools for UVs. I'm going to show you the basics. Again, you can dig deeper as you see fit. I'm going to open the UV editor. This is the new window we've seen so far. Open up this UV editor, and you may see something like this. All right. Again, you can also use the Alt key with your middle mouse button to zoom out and pan around. And what we're looking at here is the default UVs of that box. And what that means is how would this box be laid out into a flat 2D space. So this literally looks like a box that someone broke apart and just like spread out onto the sidewalk or something. Now, typically Maya it's usually good practice that this coordinate system you see here that starts with a 0 in this corner and it goes up to 1 and over to 1. This is called the 1-to-1 coordinate space. And it's just best practice to keep your UVs within this box. There's more advanced and extreme reasons to have it start to get into other coordinate spaces, but this is usually the best practice, is to keep your UVs within this 1-to-1 coordinate space here. Now I can turn on two little toggles here to see how things actually look on my model. So if I turn on this checkerboard, it automatically sticks a checkerboard on my model so I can see how things are UV. All right, so looks decent, you know, none of them are like skewed or stretched or anything like that. And we'll put a more curvy, weird shape on in a minute and see how that affects. But this first, I want to show you the basics. If I were to start to move these UVs around, so you can actually select these and move them around different ways. Notice that there's a UV toolkit that is attached to the UV editor. It has all kinds of ways that you can select different parts of the UVs. Maybe I'll select the entire shell here, and then I can use the move tool just like I can with the objects in the scene, and I can actually move these UVs. And notice, you see that on the actual object, as I'm moving these around, it's actually moving how the texture is applied. All right, so that's pretty interesting. And besides just seeing a checkerboard texture, which that's usually kind of a way to get your UVs set up right before you actually add a file, and uncheck that, and I can actually click on the image, and I can see how the image perfectly applies itself. Now, even though if I go look at my source image here, let me grab that, grab my finder of this, and take a look at my source image again. Now notice that this is not a square image, right? So this baby monkey is being forced into a square, being squished down. So that's something to be aware of, that it doesn't care at first about your aspect ratio either. It's just forcing the image to perfectly fit in the 1-to-1 ratio here. But now you can see that these are the 6 sides of the cube. In fact, I could even select a side at a time and see which side I'm clicking on. So that's the bottom. Or I could click this next one, and that's going to be this side over here. And I can see which part of the image is on which part of the model. And this is really kind of the toolkit area where you can move, separate, connect. There are tons of UV tools as far as cutting and sewing edges, splitting them, merging them. There's just a lot of things to manually move these UVs around and things like that. I'll show you a little more about this, but let me show you some basics of just actually projecting UVs and being able to change this. All right, so you get your default. Now this looks really simple because we had a 6-faced object. If our object had multiple faces, in fact, let me see if I can adjust that on the fly and see if it updates. So if I select my object here and go back into the attribute editor, go to my shape node, no, my cube 1 node, no, where is it? The shape node, oh, my polycube 1 node, here we go. If I want to increase these divisions on my cube, like 10 each, you can see now all of a sudden in my UV editor, I've got a lot more faces to deal with. So it's still the exact same layout and it's still being put in the same way, but now if I wanted to like select faces of the UV to like move them around and stuff, there's a lot more fine-tuned detail, right? So almost never will you just take the default UVs that it throws on an object and start moving those around. Usually you start with some kind of UV mapping or UV projection. I'll show you what that means here. So I'm going to close this UV editor for a moment. Close the hyper editor I've got over here. And I'm going to go back. I'm going to hit undo a few times to get my divisions back to just 1. Okay. So now if I go to the UV dropdown, these 3, the cylindrical, planar, and spherical, kind of self-explanatory, but these are the 3 basic ones to start being able to project your image in a predictable way. So planar is what we're going to use to try and project this image to only one side of this rather than wrapping it all the way around. So if I open up the tool settings in planar, we'll leave it at bounding box. I'm going to choose the x-axis and go and hit project. And notice what happened is on the object itself, it chose the x-axis, which would be going this way. If I would chose the y-axis, these would be on the top and bottom. If I chose the z-axis, they would be on the sides. It's just deciding which axis is your plane. And now we have the image actually like put up against the side. So if we were to want to like hang a picture on the wall, for example, we would have a plane or a very thin box, and we'd use planar projection to actually stick it up against the scene here. Now this object here, it's called a manipulator in Maya. This lets you interactively play with the node to position the texture, right? So if I wanted this guy to not be so stretched, I could try and, basically you can see I can play with the tiling or the actual scaling. I can play with the position of it itself, but I can kind of interactively use this node to, I press this little cross down here, and that gives me changes between this manipulator and then gives me this kind of universal one that also will let me kind of move. And I believe I can even rotate and scale the thing as well. All right, so this gives me an interesting way to change how this is set up. And undo a little bit so it's kind of set back to the default before I started playing with the manipulator. Whoops, I undid past my projection. So I'm gonna hit Command Y, which is redo, go back to my projection. All right, so I've got this projection here and it's putting on the cube properly. And you can see in the other spots, it's just like super streaky because I'm just telling it to project in one specific area. Let's take a look at our UV editor here and see how projecting on the plane changed our UVs. So if I untoggle the image, you can see that instead of that nice unfolded box in the 1-1 area, I have all these UVs just set as this flat plane like this, which is pretty interesting. But what that did is let it so that particular plane, that particular angle, this thing shows up properly on. All right, so let me take a look at a couple different projection mappings. Let's do this on a cylinder and a sphere real quickly. So if I just draw a sphere, and let's just move it, zoom out a little bit, move it up out of the way. All right, we will attach a new material, make it a Arnold standard surface material, and then I will add a map to the color channel, choose File, and now I'm going to go in and choose my baby monkey again. Now I could have just attached the same material to this. In fact, that's probably what I should do. You know, I'm going to cancel that. Let's try that, because the mapping can be different. The mapping does not follow the material. The UVs are on the object itself. So let me back up, and I'm going to open my hypershade here, and I'm going to delete this AI standard surface material I just made. And now I'm going to select, which turns this green because now it has no material selected. I'm going to select my box material, use my right mouse button to drag it and select it onto this. All right, so now I've got, by default, as you would expect, it wraps the monkey around kind of weird, but you can see a seam. All right, and that's something that when we have more organic shapes that you really want to watch out for, is to not show seams in your texture like this. All right, so let's take a look. I look at the UV editor, you can see that, whoops, there we go. With nothing selected, I don't see anything, so it is context sensitive. There's my box selected, and then here's my sphere selected. And you can see that by default, turn this off, I've got just, this is how the UVs for sphere are set up by default. These jagged things are probably the top and bottom poles of the sphere. If I turn on this checkerboard, I can see how the UVs are by default. So yeah, you can see they start to get a little squished and janky towards the poles. Right? Turn that off, turn that back on. Now to do a basic spherical map, I can go to UVs and spherical. I won't even look at the options, we'll just take the default. And that changed it. I'm not sure that's exactly what we wanted, because not only is this now just weirdly wrapped around this and all jacked up looking, but when I look at my editor, you can see that this spherical mapping made this type of UV, which is different than the original. It's less flat, but that's not always necessarily, you know, to do what you think it does with the different types of mapping. Let me show you, let's do this on a more complicated object. I can show you how the automatic mapping works, which is really a good starting point to start into manual UVs. So now let's delete this sphere completely. And I'm going to go to create polygon primitives. And let's choose either like a teapot or something we can make. Interesting. How about an ultra shape? What's an ultra shape? No, that's not what I wanted. All right, well, instead, maybe I will just pull in a model. If you haven't done this yet, you go to Window and General Editors. It's not General Editors. A moment to find this. Oh yeah, it is. Content Browser. This is what opened automatically when we were doing Paint Effects, and it opened up into the Paint Effects folder and started going into that stuff. Well, there are other things in here that we can get to. In fact, sometimes it opens up directly to these these models to use for sculpting. So I'm gonna open this dolphin. I'll open a shark. That's more fun. Double click this. Should have added a shark to our scene somewhere. There we go. It's just giant compared to everything else. It's fine, but maybe I'll scale this shark way down. I'm gonna smooth it. The 3 key, scale it way down to near the rest of our stuff. All right, now I can move it out of the way. Okay, so now we've got a shark. And if we go ahead and apply our monkey material to our shark, first of all, oh, this is nice. This isn't a very good example of, because this shark already has its UVs kind of flattened out. All right, so I'll do this in a different example, but I'll show you now. If we go ahead and assign favorite material or assign existing material box mat to our shark, we can see that our monkey is showing up on our shark. And if I select the shark, you can see in our UV editor that it has these UV pieces that are set up, right? So this is how it's going to actually. So ideally, if we were actually texturing the shark, we would create a texture image, and it's really common to like take this view, take a screenshot of this. In fact, you can save images out of this, I'm pretty sure, in the menu somewhere, or you can just take a screenshot. Bring this into Photoshop and use this as like a reference layer that's like partially faded out. And then you can actually paint your texture in 2D to actually paint how you would want your texture to show up kind of around your model like this. And that's usually, that's one of the workflows. You can go back and forth from Photoshop and kind of, whoops, stick that there. All right, but let me show you how to get like UVs like this. That wasn't a good example because, because that model already had UVs on it. So let me instead grab let's do create polygons. Let's start with a cube, but let's give it some more stuff. Go into the cube, we'll give it 10, and then we will open our modeling toolkit, turn on soft selection. Now maybe we'll choose face, and now let's just make this a funky shape. So that's something up here, great, let's smooth it. Pull something out on this side too. So you guys get the idea, right? So we've got this funky shape now. And now with this funky shape, if I select it, stop it. Select, okay. Let me do it over here. Select my cube, right click, assign existing material, assign the box mat, and by default, you see our object is spread all over it. If I open up the UV editor, it's my plane. I select my box, my cube material. You can see the UVs are still the same here, but it's all like squashed and stretched all over the place. If I were to apply a planar UV, it would still just try and stick it across the front, which isn't going to do us very good. But what we want is to be able to set up some quick UVs that are like really trying to project it from all angles. And Maya has a nice starter for that by going to UV, and then there's this automatic projection. I'm going to take a look at okay, so 6 planes is the default, showing like how many different angles it's going to be projecting from. There's a bunch of different options here. It's not really necessary to go through them, but if I just go to UV automatic projection, you can see that it creates these 6 different kind of projected planes. And it's going to try and create UVs based on a complicated shape, based on 6 different planar projections, and doing its best to create, oops, got lost in my selections, I'm going to undo, there we go. And if I take a look at the UV editor, now all of a sudden I have all of these little shells, right? So if I were to deselect, select this, accidentally selecting my plane. Go over here, cube. I can see these individual shells. If I turn on my texture or apply a texture to it, I think I lost my texture, okay? Now I can see that these are the different shells of how this is going to actually apply to my model. If I go look and take a quick look, we're back at Google Images here with all of our baby monkeys. And if I were to search for, let's see, Maya UV, okay. So here's a good example of a character UV set. Open this up. Oh, this is actually coming from the Maya help menu, so that's cool. But you can see this image. I'm trying to zoom in on it, but it's not letting me right now. But basically, this is very typical for a character where you'll spend a reasonable amount of time creating these UVs and where their seams are. You can see the face is all this weird, like flattened out thing. And then you can actually use this in 2D to paint your textures. If you use a different program where you can actually paint textures in 3D, I'll show you how you can do that. In Maya, you can actually paint some textures in 3D using the paint tools. This is pretty much the workflow. Is you create all these complicated UVs, and then you're able to kind of paint in 2D and put the textures exactly where you want them to be. I'm showing you this, and it's definitely beyond the scope of this class for us to create really complicated UVs on a complicated model. But I just want you to understand the basics of being able to create a simple projected texture, and then understand how, like, as your model gets more complicated, your UVs to texture it is going to get more complicated as well. And you don't have to do this to the entire model. You can create textures on individual faces of a model. I'm going to delete some things. All right, delete my cube, my plane. I'm going to assign my floor material back to my plane, add a box, got our box, move it up, got our plane, standard surface to that, assign new material, AI standard surface to that. Okay, I'm going to frame in on my box. Outliner, like I got a couple cubes in there. Go to that one, select this one, frame in on it. Okay, so I got my standard surface here, box matte. So now I will add my monkey back into this. File texture, baby monkey JPEG, happening on my other screen. In there, hit the 6 key. I see everything. Looks like I put the baby monkey on everything. So let me choose the ground again. Right click, object mode, assign new material, Arnold AI standard surface. There we go. So 2 separate materials. Now I'll add my planar projection back onto my cube. UV, planar, great. Like, actually, I'm curious what happens if I just do a automatic on a cube. All right, well, yeah, interesting. I'll go back to the planar. UV, planar mapping. Okay, one thing I want to point out before I forget is sometimes I just added the planar map. If I go back to object mode, now all of a sudden that manipulator is gone, right? And even if I go to, let's say, open up my hypershade, go into my box material, right click, graph network, even if I click on this place 2D texture node, which is the one I need, it doesn't necessarily bring that manipulator back up. Now, I could go ahead and monkey with elements of it, and it will change things, but it's nice to have that manipulator. So let me show you how to get that back. This is where we deal with the channel editor, or the channel box, all right? So if I have the channel box open here for my object, and it shows me, I've got my P-cube2, which is where I have my transform node for all the translating, rotating, and scale. Then I have this inputs down here, and it shows me that I've got my polycube2 input. I can click that, and that's the actual width, height, and divisions. And then I've got the polyplanar projection 1 input, all right? And if I select this input, this again has all these attributes that I could drag around and change and stuff. But if I select this object, I can use this tool up here called the Show Manipulator tool. So inside of Modify Transform Tools, this is where I showed you before, under Modify Transform Tools, this is where the Move, Rotate, and Scale tool are. This is where that Universal Manipulator is. There's a tool down here called Show Manipulator tool. If I click on that, then it brings it back, all right? So there's a lot of different things inside Maya that have different types of manipulators. Like you can create I think the area lights and Arnold have different manipulators as well. You can kind of visually adjust their fall off and stuff. But at any point you want to kind of select a channel. So this is, you know, that's not the same manipulator. And as soon as I click on the projection input, again, it goes away until I hit that show manipulator tool. This is the last tool. So that's important to kind of get this thing back in case you need it. So now let me show you an actual bump map. It's a little bit different. So if I open up Hypershade, I'm looking at my material over here, box material. You can see it on a shader ball. You can choose all these different things to look at it. If I want to look at it in a plane, I can see that. Look at it on a sphere, see all the different ways, even on an ocean splash, which is pretty sweet looking, but that's starting to make my interactivity go down very quickly. So with some materials, shaders, it'll be helpful to see in this little preview, but in this case, let's look at it on our cube. What we can do is we can map other attributes besides just the color. So let's try, you could play with all these different things, diffuse, roughness, metalness, you could add attributes to those, but to get some really quick, good results, we can go down to the geometry area. And under geometry, there is a bump mapping and an opacity area. Both of these are really powerful. So bump mapping, we'll start with that. I'm gonna add a map to my bump mapping area. And this time, instead of doing a file, I could use a file. I could use any type of image. Grayscale image is usually what people use for these types of things, that the different levels of white or black denote different values. But we can use one of these other types of nodes, one of these procedural nodes. Now, a file node or PSD file node, you can actually have a layered Photoshop file come in as a material, which is really cool. There's a map. Most of these other ones, like Mountain or Mandelbrot for fractals, or noise, Brownian, leather, granite, these are what are called procedural texture or maps, meaning that they're not images, they're just generated through math and through 3D or through the program. So I'm going to choose noise as a map on my bump, and right away I can see that this preview has got like a bunch of it looks like it's beat up all of a sudden. If I drag this out of the way and look at my cube, I can see this bump map, this noise that's happening on this particular side. In fact, maybe I should take a look at a render to see how it's really looking. Open that up. Maybe I'll get a little bit closer to it so you can see. But this is a very, very common 3D technique that, besides just wrapping a texture around a particular, in the color shade, the bump mapping one will allow you, see, if I made this noise a little smaller, it might look a little better. But what this does is allow you, without actually adding new geometry, it allows you to add some texture to your actual object. It allows you to make something look like it's got some subtle imprints of leather, or anything like that, really. If I look at my Hypershade again and graph my box mat node, I can see that now, besides my place 2D texture, got a couple different place 2D texture nodes. I've got a new one that's got this noise node that then adds this bump 2D node. And now this is adding to the normal of the camera. And if we got a lot more advanced, you could start to understand how you can add nodes and just kind of connect them to different things to get all these different effects. But the basics of that are just creating maps on these different channels. So again, the color channel, if I go back and select this material here, the very top, the color channel is the one where we would put a file texture that you want to show through. And then down here under geometry, this bump mapping channel is where we can add. So here, let me click on my noise node. Now my noise node, I had all of these different attributes, right? So whether I look at them in here, or I look at them in the channel editor, or I could even open the attribute editor. Let's see, I'll make these smaller density. Randomness, let's try dragging the density down a bit, giving me a weird effect. Doesn't really matter. I'm gonna drag, I can drag the frequency down quite a bit. And well, anyway, there's tons of options in here to affect the way some of these different materials work. The moral is just showing you how you can take materials that have like bumpiness to them, like having getting like a granite texture or anything like that, and you're going to apply it to a map, and you'll start to see that in 3D. In fact, let's do this to an actual map real quick. I want to show you a good, as far as finding file textures. If you just go to textures.com, there are an unbelievable amount of awesome textures in here that you can get. So let's take plaster, for example. Yeah, let's take this plaster. So if I grab this plaster texture, there's a bunch of different types. All right, let's take this basic bare plaster texture. More of them in here. Take this one. No, this is 8K. I don't need an 8K texture. Oh, there is less versions of it here. I'll go into it. All right, so there's all these different versions. Now, this all matters when you're doing like really high resolution renders as far as the texture resolution. Oh, looks like we need a credit to download this. Okay. Well, how about I search for a free one? You guys understand that basically, as you can see this rendered, a lot of times it's really common to take like the file texture itself and map that into the color node. And then you could have like a grayscale version of the exact same texture, and you can map that onto the bump node. And that will give you a nice look like this, that besides just the file texture, it'll add some extra depth based on that actual bump map. Another one that's really common to use is the transparency. So let me show you that. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm just going to get rid of this bump map one for right now. And I can literally just select these nodes and delete them in the graph. I look at it and it's updating my render view and updated my viewport already, and now that's all gone. But if I wanted to apply a texture to the opacity, now first off, if I were to just remember that if I drag the opacity of this down to like 50%, in anything in Maya or in Maya with Arnold that you deal with opacity, you can see this start to fade a little bit. But it's really, really important to always remember that anything with any kind of transparency or opacity, when you're coming with materials in Maya and Arnold, you need to open the attribute editor, select the object, and go to its initial node that you used to draw it. It's shape node, here it is, the cube shape node. And there's an Arnold tab. And under the Arnold tab, you need to uncheck opaque. And that will make it so, okay, now I will officially, now it doesn't look too different here, but when you add a lot of effects and things, it'll make a big difference. Now it will actually render as if it's partially transparent. And that's just the default in Arnold because it's so easy to blow up rendering times with having too much transparency and stuff. But with this map here, instead of just dragging the opacity down, add an actual map to it. So I can take a checkerboard map, for example, which is pure black and white, and I added that, and now it added these new nodes to it, going into the opacity channel. So you can see it added another place 2D texture node, which you can select and affect how it actually adds to it. And then it's got the actual checker pattern, which has, you can change the colors of the checkers and all kinds of stuff you can change within that pattern node. And it's just connecting into the opacity channel. But now you can see what happened is now it actually, without having to model that detail, it is taking the opacity of that model or of that map and applying it to the actual texture. So it looks really nice on the front and back where it's mapped properly with UVs, and then on the sides it's all streaky. But that's really, really powerful of a thing to know that you could, for example, you could model a leaf, and this is what we saw when we were doing the paint effects. You could see when I converted them to meshes, they would render in Arnold. Some of them would have had to have been adjusted in here to attach to the right opacity node. But the way that Paint Effects was doing the leaves is they were just plain. So the mesh, the geometry was extremely simple. But then they had a complicated leaf that had basically a leaf texture that they would apply to the color channel. And then they had a black and white like silhouette of the leaf that they would apply to the opacity channel. And wherever it's black, it becomes transparent. Wherever it's not, it's not. That is really the basics that I wanted to go through with texturing, is in a nutshell that when you create an object, if you were to look in this UV editor, you're going to see the UVs, opening on other screens, you're going to see the UVs of that particular object and how they're laid out by default. You want to use these mapping by opening up your material and being able to click these little things. The color map is where you can actually put a file texture and have it show through. And then down here under geometry, being able to use the opacity or the bump mapping to create either see-through effects or have more kind of bump surface to materials. Now, those of you that have gotten kind of advanced in other programs, you may have heard of displacement mapping and normal mapping. Those are both, I'm not really going to go into that. You can definitely do that in Maya, but having normal maps and displacement maps, those are more advanced ways to basically do bump mapping. And especially normal maps are very, very common in game engines because a lot of these things are ways for you to get like the maximum amount of detail in your renderings without having to put that detail in the geometry. So being able to use that transparency channel to very quickly make complicated effects is very, very powerful without having to actually model it. So you see this fencing here? This was actually done with a material. And this actual like see-through transparency, this was just done with the material. So this would have been insane. These are tiny little hexes to model this type of mesh and just be way too heavy for rendering and everything. But what this student ended up doing was just having real basic model and creating a complicated, repeatable kind of hexagon mesh look in a map and added that to the transparency map to get this effect.